Question Lane is a podcast where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is an author, professor of philosophy, and chair of the Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies at the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland. Today's series of questions and answers will be centered around Area 2, education, and Area 8, sex, specifically his book, The Man Not Race, Class, Genre, and Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Our guest today is Dr. Tommy J. Curry. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. What would you like to be referred to as, Dr. Curry, Professor Curry, or Tommy?
Yeah, Dr. Curry, Professor Curry, either one of those is fine. Whatever suits you.
Perfect. Is there anything you want us to know about you before we get started?
No. Are you going to read a bio and all that stuff before in the front matter, or?
No, I just, whatever you want to say.
Okay, yeah, I'll do a brief introduction of myself then. So my name is Dr. Tommy J. Curry. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, where I hold a personal chair in Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies. Most of my research involves studies of structural racism and anti-blackness, but particularly I'm interested in the kind of lethal violence and trauma that black men and boys suffer in the United States and other countries around the world. A large part of my research focus and scholarship is trying to create a theory that accounts for the sexual vulnerability that black men and other racialized men face within Western patriarchal societies, and how traditional academic theories, be it feminism, gender studies, or even black studies, continues to overlook this genocidal dynamic towards this group.
Perfect. So for those that may be unfamiliar with you, you are a black male, is that correct?
That's correct.
What has the transition been like for you as a black male going from the United States to Scotland?
It's been extraordinary. In a lot of ways, somewhat shocking. I think that being in the United States and even going through graduate school in the United States, the idea is that UK universities are extremely hostile to black scholars and black academics. But I found the environment here, while it's predominantly white, to have a fundamentally different character than the universities in the United States. And you have to remember, I left Texas A&M after being attacked by the alt-right. So given the kinds of violence, people constantly calling me a nigger, people threatening to kill me, my family, my two daughters, to come to Europe and have people actually be interested in the plight of a black person, specifically black men in the United States, was a breath of fresh air. The societies are completely different. Even though I'm a minority in Scotland, there's not the threat of violence towards me walking down the street or holding an unpopular opinion the same way that there is in the United States. Now, in the United States, I grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I was born in 1979 at the very tail end of segregation. So I grew up in an environment that was filled with racial antipathy towards black people, where black people were generally understood to be workers and were mired in extreme forms of poverty. When I moved to the north to go to school, I saw different things. I saw black people and white people interacting, but the idea of racial inferiority was still in the air. When I went up north, really, to Kansas City, to Chicago, places like that, it was kind of the first time that I saw black people code switch and deny the kind of the sting of racism, kind of de-emphasize it to get along with white people. Being from the South, it was always very clear. Black people were on one side, white people were on the other. So growing up in that environment, right, where there's always racial antagonism, the threat of racial violence, coming to Europe where that's not so much the case, you see other issues, mired in class, mired in xenophobia. There is a very real anti-blackness here, but it's not the kind of virulent, violent, lethal kind of pressure and intimidation I think I see in the United States constantly.
Wow, that is interesting, and I'll definitely get into code switching later on in the discussion. But do you think it's possibly because there's not a lot of black people in Scotland specifically that there might not be a lot of tensions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't want to give the pretense that it's a rosy place in that way. Okay. But you're right, because there's not a critical mass of black people in Scotland, so you don't see the same kind of violence and the same kind of militaristic police tactics and residential segregation schemes used to control that population. But given that, since I've been here about 5 months now, I've certainly seen that there is an anti-blackness. There's a view of black people that is very similar to the United States, where they're thought to be dancers. I went to a play once. I was the only black person in the whole audience. It was Barbershop Chronicles, and I come to my row, and a white woman tells me, "Oh, shouldn't you be on stage dancing?" Right. So there are still those racist stereotypes, right? That black people can't come simply to enjoy a theater production, but I should be on the stage dancing as if that's the only thing that we're capable of. There have been other things where people have constantly said we need to de-emphasize race. Black people are the racists because they're the ones trying to point out, this issue with skin color, this issue with prejudice, this issue with discrimination. No, there are very real forms of racism in Scotland and in UK universities. I don't want to give that pretense. But when you look at the United States, and I've been very clear about this in my writings, you see tactics of institutional and societal discrimination that are built around managing racial populations. And one of the ways that you manage racial populations in the United States is not just through segregation, right, or redlining. It's also through violence. That because Scotland doesn't have that critical mass, it hasn't had to use violence. It doesn't need the complicity of its civil society to suggest that black people should be killed or black people should be incarcerated at extraordinary rates, as in the case in the United States, where we know that's a daily occurrence there. So it could be the case that that's certainly coming, right, if immigration and things like that change in the UK. But for right now, much of the discrimination or much of the racism that I see is very much ideological, very much based in notions of ancestry, history, and stereotypes that were formulated within the era of colonialism and empire in the UK.
Thank you for clarifying that up, because I was just curious about that for sure. Being that you were a guest quite a few times on the Cows, I'm pretty sure you share the same definition as racism as do Gus, and possibly I do as well. Is that correct?
I think so. I mean, if we're thinking about racism as white supremacy, yes.
Correct.
And, in my work, I've referred to it as a process that brings about inferiority and seeks to materialize this idea of racial inferiority through segregation, violence, apartheid, etc. So I think rather than us talking about racism as just a way of thinking, it's a disposition that creates social structures, entities, and institutions that bring about the death and dying of oppressed populations. And for me, that's very important because it's something that we could measure. It's something that we could see in looking at the demographic health, the population growth, the sickness or wellness of certain racialized groups compared to white groups or the dominant group in charge of the society at the time. And I think that it takes a different kind of discussion, rationalization, and analysis to account for that versus just trying to change the way white people think.
Yeah, and the key word I picked up from what you said is measure. I'm more of an analytical type of person just because of the nature of my work. So I'm very appreciative in terms of your insistence on measuring outcomes and measuring what racism looks like.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to dive right into the book. Now, the book, before I get into the questions, the book was definitely... wow, the book was a lot. I'll say that. The book was very well researched. I needed a dictionary, and
Thank you.
I'm younger. I'm in my 20s, so some of this information was new to me. But at the same time, like I said, I needed to read the book twice just to make sure I got all the concepts down. But before I get into the crux of the book, why did you decide to research and write about the mistreatment of black males in America? Because you could have wrote about anything or focused on anything to research in your career, but why did you decide to write research about that?
To be honest with you, it was because of systematic neglect that I saw happening, in my field of philosophy, as well as in the academy at large. I came up, I started my career as a young professor talking about critical race theory, systemic racism, things of that nature. And that was so controversial for people. People were yelling at me. People were screaming at me in panels because I said racism is permanent and all white people, benefit from that system. And then there became a moment where I noticed that none of these conversations centered on black men. That we talk about rates of mass incarceration, but I would constantly point out, well, given what we know about mass incarceration, this targets men, right? It targets all groups of poor men especially, but black men particularly. So why are we not centering black men when there are over 95% of the black people incarcerated? And one of the responses I got was, well, we center men all the time. We center black men in everything, so we need to decenter them. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense to me if black men are victims. Yeah, we shouldn't center black men in everything, right? So we shouldn't have this idea that all racism is talking about black men, and we should understand how black women and other groups of black people suffer. But you can't tell me that in a world where black men are the primary victims of a certain kind of violence, that they should not be talked about. That's dehumanized. And what inevitably started happening, the first chapter of the book that I wrote was actually chapter 4 on eschatological dilemmas. And I presented this at a conference, Philosophy Born to Struggle, one year was at Purdue. And, the nature of that chapter, or the topic of that chapter, is about black men being raped during slavery. And what I wanted to show was that the history of sexual violence, lynching, genital mutilation, rape, through sodomy, anal penetration, was something that carried on through law enforcement. So I gave this historical narrative of what happened to us during slavery. I talked about, through James Baldwin's analysis of homoeroticism, what happened to black men when they were lynched by law enforcement. And then I gave all these contemporary examples of how black men, even today, suffer genital mutilation, being penetrated with screwdrivers, batons, guns, anally, and how these are very much the very same practices that black men have been talking about for the last 100 years. And one of the things that happened when I gave that paper was a black feminist in the audience booed me. And I wasn't booed because something I said was incorrect, etc. I was booed because I chose to discuss black men. And the claim was, because you're studying black men, you're taking focus off of black women, right? And that can't be allowed. And I said, wow, right? I'm talking about a kind of analysis about black men as victims of sexual violence. And the first reaction to that isn't, wow, we have something more to understand here, is that we can't talk about black men who are victims of sexual violence, because if we do, then that's going to take the attention away from, as she said, the real victims of sexual violence, which are women. So it's this kind of feminist ideology, right, that I encountered off front when I started trying to have conversations about black men. And as I started presenting this topic more, and this is what really, really changed me and challenged me, I started meeting black men who were victims of sexual assault and rape. So I was having an academic conversation about rape during slavery, rape during Jim Crow, etc. And then I started meeting black men who were survivors, and these black men would come up to me and say, hey, that happened to me. And I didn't have any resources for them. So I'm meeting black men who were survivors of sexual assault, and I'm having that very same conversation. But I didn't have anything to say to them at the time, because I wasn't taught in grad school or pointed to any resources where people were actually studying black men who were victims of sexual violence. So I decided to write a book that talked about black men as being sexually vulnerable throughout history, and that included not only rape during Jim Crow and slavery and our contemporary society, but also their victimization, their early ages of sexual debut, their vulnerability to domestic violence, their vulnerability to sexual victimization. These are important topics that have always been with black men, and black men have been talking about them, right? We can see example after example. We see J.A. Rogers writing about this in his book on Sex and Race, Volume 2. We see Archibald Grimke writing about this in 1913. We see W.E.B. Du Bois talking about in his soliloquy how he was raped as a young boy, staying over to someone's house when he was traveling, in the Northeast. We have tons of accounts of black men throughout history showing us, telling us, giving us stories about their sexual victimization. And before the man not, I honestly can't think of any single text that read black men through their own narratives. Right? You have people who are reading, like, Extravagant Objection, Derek Scott's work, that's reading black men through something like Toni Morrison's fiction. But you didn't have a book where they're saying, look at what black men are saying. Look at black men's stories, right? Why are we not analyzing Finding Fish, The Antoine Fisher story. Why are we not analyzing these texts where black men are saying, here's how we are abused within these systems of neglect? It's not all death. Some of it is about our victimization, our assault, the physical and emotional abuse that we go through. And if we don't think differently about those systems and traumas, then the only thing we do is we reduce black men down to the corpse. So the book is inspired because I'm trying to get the world to see that, yes, black men certainly are exterminated within through lethal violence in patriarchal societies, right? I think Jim Sedanius and Felicia Prado, social dominance theory, has done a great job explaining why that happens. But what we have not done a great job with is understanding how when we over-determine black men through the processes of death, or as the end result of death is the corpse, we miss all the vulnerability that happens in the midst of dying. We miss the negations of emotional abuse, of abandonment, of child abuse, of early sexual debut, of poverty, of trauma, and how this resonates and builds up in the soul of black men and boys, right? So the book is very much a new way of thinking, I think a paradigm shift into how we understand and how we interpret that sort of neglect. And I think that a lot of people, because they're so uncomfortable thinking about the humanity of black males, prefer to think of the book as an attack, right? They want to see the book as an attack against feminism or attack against gender theory or whatever the case, that's their own interest. But I think that for all the people that have read the book, and the reason that it has something like 20 positive academic reviews in American Book Awards is because people see the humanity of black men and boys that I'm fighting for, right? And that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to give us a way to analyze and to better see how black men actually live and suffer in the world, so that we're not just thinking of black men as dead bodies and corpses, but we're actually thinking about black men as the product, the sociological product, and being imposed upon by certain kind of violences that's negating their humanity, and that they're constantly in a battle to stave off dehumanization.
And as I said earlier, man, you really put a lot of research into this book because
Absolutely.
Some of the cases that I read about, I had no idea about. For example, the Angel Perez and Corey Green and Andre Little. It was really, like I said, it was very tough to read, to be honest. That's why I said I had to read it twice just to.
No, but it's heartbreaking.
Man,
it's heartbreaking, and I'll be honest. Many days, I had a great support system. My wife, some of my colleagues, both men and women. When I first started hearing these stories of black men being raped, mostly by older women, but either by some other men, it was tough for me to learn to process that, because no one taught me. Like, I'm a philosopher by training, I'm a theorist, so no one taught me how to process the pain of individuals. So, I almost, sometimes even when I'm on panels talking about it, I'm almost on the brink of tears, because there's so much pain that I've heard from black men who survived. There's so much pain behind their stories that no one wants to acknowledge. And it's not, this isn't like, see, in the academy, if you're going to talk about, the suffering of black girls or black women, there's people ready to listen. Nobody's willing to challenge the stories, right, of those people's humanity. But when you study black men and boys, the first thing that happens is they're trying to negate it, right? So we've done studies, right? Me and Dr. Ellie have done studies on, through black men's own words, because when I first started to present on this material, I was using CDC data, I was using some of the bigger sets, of victimization, point to NCVS prevalence, things of that sort. And I was saying, listen, like, this is a problem. Female perpetrated violence, male to male perpetrated violence to younger boys, these are real problems in our community that we're not talking about. And people were just not convinced by the data. So I said, okay, let's combine the data with these actual stories. And when I started bringing in the stories of these black men who were recounting how they first had their first sexual encounter or how they were abused, people didn't want to hear the stories, because the argument then was, this is just anecdotal. This is just something that happened to one or two people. And that's what I became so frustrated, because I said, I'm confused. On the one hand, when you show people the data, you want to negate the data, even though it's the same data sets that we use, that black feminists constantly use to point out the victimization of black women and girls. I've never negated the data. I said, look, it's incomplete because we know the issues are underreported, but that's on both sides. But this gives us an idea of how people are suffering, how people are experiencing victimization. But the minute that I switched that over to black men and boys, somehow the very same data sets, the very same survey methodology is up for question. Now the data set right under 4.3, right, 4.4, we can't look at because we don't want to believe that black men and boys suffer from sexual violence the way they do. We don't want to believe that black men and boys suffer at the hands of domestic abuse from their mothers the way that they do. We just can't believe that because we've been taught only to think of black men as their corpses. Right? And then when you push people on that, when you push people beyond their comfort zone and say, look at the danger and the vulnerability that young black men and boys have, that black males have in our society and our communities as well, they become angry. They don't want to hear the stories because they've bought into a certain vision of black men where we expect their death, but we have very, very little investments in their actual living. Right? And that's what the man that's trying to change. So I knew that I had to research. I knew the book had to be better than anything that was ever written on the topic before. Because if I missed something, if I made a mistake, people would jump on that and say, oh, we should dismiss the whole project. So every sentence has 3, 4, 5 references. Every claim, every data set has secondary literature. Every archive has, meticulous notes about where it was found and the other sentences before and after it, right? Every claim about intersectionality has secondary materials of people interpreting it the same way and, footnotes upon footnotes on footnotes. And the reason I did that is because I knew that it would have to stand up not only to the academic rigor, but to the ideological bias that suggests that any way that you try to attempt to study black men against the grain of feminism and intersectionality, or even outside of deficit models, would be something that would be gravely challenged, right? And the book has withstood those challenges, right? So I just think that it's just the way, it just had to be written that way because it was the foundation of a new way of thinking.
I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to get this on record.
Sure.
What is more important to you, achieving justice for males classified as black or for the masses of black people?
For the masses of black people. I mean, those go hand in hand.
Now, I ask that because, this term intersectionality, I was born in the 90s. Where I'm from, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I didn't hear about this term until I became an adult. Intersectionality, what in the world is that? And why do you think black feminists use black female needs and issues to be above the needs of the masses of black people, which is what people like you point out, even though you do research on black males?
Yeah, I mean, I actually recently had a conversation with someone, and and every time you have an argument about black feminism, they always say, well, there's so many black feminisms, right, that we can't really understand. And I just think that's a rhetorical trope to try to prevent anyone from ever criticizing it. Intersectionality has a very specific history. In the late 80s, and even in the early 80s, you have the idea of double jeopardy, right? This idea that black women are suffering from racism and sexism. And there's no real argument against that, right? The argument isn't that. I mean, it's one of those things where, sure, one could understand that black women suffer from racism and sexism and classism, etc. The problem is that many of these black feminist theorists wanted to suggest that because black women suffer from these two dynamics that they recognize, that they were somehow more oppressed and more disadvantaged than their male counterpart. So then, of course, that brings about the question, well, then why not just test it? And then every time you test it from the 1980s forward, it doesn't give you the same kind of results. So in the 1980s, when Kimberly Crenshaw is writing this, based on Title VII jurisprudence, she wants black women to be a protected class because she's saying that, look, when you start looking at certain cases, you could sue under race, and that was good for black men because she thinks that black men were only affected by racism, which is completely false, but nonetheless, that's her argument. And then white women could sue under sex because they're the idea of womanhood, right? So she's like, but black women are excluded from these things because black women have an intersection of race and sex within the categories of the law. And that makes sense in terms of a jurisprudential understanding of those categories, though I think it's important to recognize that when they were actually debating Title VII, the idea of race actually applied to women because they were not going to hire black men in these kind of corporate or white-collar positions. But nonetheless, that's how she interprets those specific cases she was looking at. The problem is that they've used this to be an analogy, right? Black feminists have taken this intervention in Title VII jurisprudence and used it, or anti-discrimination law, and used it as an analogy for all of history. And that's where the problem comes in. Because now what we're saying is that throughout history, the only two categories that have been in conflict, right, in this way that they exclude each other, have been race and sex. And then we could take definitions of race and sex from the 1960s or 1970s and apply that all the way back to reading history as far back as the 1800s. And no other group of people, no other theory in the world has made such an asinine claim, because other theories understand that there are geographical and temporal and spatial limitations to what terms mean. For example, in the 1800s, the notion of gender didn't apply to black people, because the notion of gender was based on whether or not certain groups had evolved sex roles and sexual differentiation with each other. So the mark of a civilized race, if you're talking past the 1850s, wasn't actual gender equality, it was gender inequality. Now, black people, because they were savages, didn't even have gender, so the only group that had gender were white people, which is why all these white feminists or the white suffragettes were not talking about themselves as being oppressed as women. They were talking about women being a class of slaves, right? So how do you explain that? So the gender category actually meant the race category in the 19th century. It meant the position of the slave. And we can go through tons of examples of this, right? But the issue is that nobody's ever asked. Nobody's ever said that the category of gender itself that we're using, which is a very modern concept, really birthed in the 1940s and 1950s, may have racist undertones, right? That why is it that when they're looking at a minority group, they're looking at black people in the South, they're looking at black men in segregation and Jewish people that are suffering the Holocaust? And white women like Helen Hacker and Simone de Beauvoir and Alva Myrtle said, hey, white women could appropriate that suffering, and since we're not a racial minority group, let's call ourselves a gender minority group. So you get the idea that woman is a minority group. And intersectionality unproblematically assimilates all this stuff. It just has the intuitive assertion that if you're black, you're disadvantaged to white, and if you're a female, you're disadvantaged to male. And then that calculus generates and drives a whole lot of the discourse. So then when you look at that within the black community, Kimberly Crenshaw sets up a hierarchy, right? This is her analogy of the basement, that everybody's oppressed, but some people are closer to the floor in the basement than people who are at the bottom of the basement. So she wants to create a system of analysis that allows us to see how black men are above black women, how black women are always at the bottom. The problem is that there's been no empirical study to actually situate that systematically. You're going to have certain situations where black men have advantages to black women and where black women have advantages over black men. Examples of that would be, for example, someone looked at the income gap, 3 to 4 cents of what black men make versus black women, but you look at black women's life expectancy, lack of incarceration rates compared to black men, mortality, homicide, education, etc., all places where black women have solid historical and multi-decade advantages over black men. So the intersectionality intervenes as a way for people to say, oh, we should build coalitions, but those coalitions have to be built around these kinds of feminist ideas. And those feminist ideas have historically been exclusive of black men. So you look at people like Miriam Matsuda, for instance, when she's talking about Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of political intersectionality, she says, look, we don't want another race man. We don't want another rise of a black messiah. Well, that's a problem for black men because historically coalitions with other groups of people like white women have always created and been mediated by the fear, danger, and the myth of the black rapist that black men were thought to pose to white women. So if you say that you have an interest in coalitional logics and coalitional politics, well, there's a certain privilege with that because you can work with white women, you can work with Latina women, you can work with white men in ways that black men have historically not been able to because black men have been caricaturized as threat, dangers, and sexual predators in many of the same spaces that you have not. But then black men, because they chose different styles of leadership, right? Radical organization, charismatic leadership, right? The Messiah trope through churches and through different revolutionary rhetorics and organizations, that becomes something that we should never do again. You see, it's a dishonest kind of liberal reformism. And when we get into the real meat of the issue, which is whether or not black men suffer racism differently than black women and vice versa, then we see tremendous disparities between how black men suffer police encounters, incarceration, homicide, healthcare access, etc. But there's this issue where people don't want to concede that. So when you get to the most recent literature on intersectional visibility, for instance, and people say, yeah, you're right, patriarchal societies target and kill black men much more than they do black women, and they call this intersectional visibility, then people say, but that's a privilege, right? So part of black male privilege is that patriarchies value you more, so they kill you more. And that's where we are as intellectuals, right? So intersectionality has this long political and intellectual legacy over the last 30 years of highlighting black women's suffering, but also trying to create a system that doesn't allow for black men to come out at the bottom of any specific empirical measure. So it's a constant process of denial. It's a constant process of playing a kind of identitarian calculus that one-ups somebody. And then even when you have to concede, yes, black men are in jail more than black women, right? Almost 900,000 to 64,000. Yes, black men have the lowest life expectancy. Yes, black men are the most homeless. Somehow there's always an excuse. Well, we shouldn't center black men. This is the danger of these kinds of gymnastics, because it's not really about the suffering, the life, the humanity of the people that are being affected by these kinds of systems of oppression, but rather how intellectuals can rationalize away and de-emphasize the suffering of certain groups of people. And I think that's the problem in intersectionality, right? And of course people are going to say, well, that's just how some people use it. That's not the theory itself. Well, somebody needs to take, at some point, someone has to take accountability for how the theory developed in that way for 30 years. Because everyone says that the theory has potential to do this, the theory has the potential to study black men, but then for the last 30, 35 years, every notion of the theory that's tried to talk about black men has always viewed them as pathological and violent, right? So we have to do some real work, both intellectually and in the black community, to understand that, yeah, intersectionality does make a contribution and we should consider different viewpoints, but you cannot predict the way that intersectionality theorists want to do, that black men are always going to be privileged and black women are always going to be disadvantaged given that dynamic.
I found it interesting that you said that the savage races, quote unquote, which we fit in, black people fit in, were considered female. I mean, not female, feminine.
Yeah,
and
feminine. Yeah.
Black males were not considered. They were considered feminine up until puberty, in which that term was replaced with a rapist or a beast or something that could be.
Yeah, that's William Lee Howard's work in 1903. Yes.
Yeah, that was something that I read, and I never knew anything about that. But one thing that I will say though, Sojourner Truth, I heard the name growing up, one line in class. But what I found interesting was her views and how they were very similar to Elizabeth Stanton's. Can you talk about her views and how they matched?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I mean, I think that at some point, and I don't know if this will be with my work, but, we have to take a real look at the racist history of American suffragism, right, and even British suffragism, right? Suffragettes brought with them a certain racial view. And that racial view was not based on mistaken ideology, but science. So these people believed in ethnology. And the view they had was that, look, black men are savages. Black men are rapists. And if you let black men be free, they're going to make it too dangerous for white women to come into the public. This was a consistent view, right? So it's not like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Phoebe Cousins, Belle Kearney, all these women were somehow under some delusion that it's just that they don't like black men. No, they bought into the racist ethnological foundations of the 19th century. Once we understand that, and then you can find this in books like, Louise Newman's The Origins of White Women's Rights, then you get into a whole different conversation. Well, then why is it that Sojourner Truth's statements about black men completely mirror that of all the white suffragettes at the time? And I think that once we understand that point of view, then we can see that, look, Sojourner Truth in many ways bought into the idea that black men were beasts, that black men were lazy, that black men were dangerous, and that black men were brutes. And we can say, well, she's still making a point about black women's victimization, but not really, because the same argument she makes about black women is the same argument that Elizabeth Cady Stanton makes and Phoebe Cousins makes. The idea was that, look, black women are oppressed because they're black and they're attached to slavery, But they're doubly oppressed, and notice this issue here that Cousin says. They're doubly oppressed because they're women and they're forced to be the wives of savages, right? They're forced to be the wives of black men. Notice it's not just because they're a woman, but it's because the position that they're put in next to black men, because black men are abusers. And Phoebe Cousin says, well, from the law of slavery, black men have learned to be worse abusers and masters than white men. So the idea was that black men were even though white men were violent during slavery, black men were even more violent to women and children, right? At least the white master was benevolent. I'm sorry?
Which makes no sense.
Which makes no sense. No, because this is all white suffragist, propaganda, because they're trying to convince the world that black men are not really men, they're brutes, and they don't deserve the right to vote, right? So there's a political agenda here. So because of that, and notice this is where you get the idea that black men are abusers of women and children, right? So this issue about domestic abuse doesn't kick up in the 1980s with the launch of the Duluth model. This notion of black men being domestic abusers starts in the 1860s when they're fighting for the right to vote, right? So the idea is that black men, because they're savages, can never respect the right of women as voters and as intellectuals. They're fundamentally misogynistic. Well, Sojourner Truth comes along, and she sides with that narrative. So the reason I put the whole quote in the book was because I said, look, every time I read a black feminist interpretation of Sojourner Truth, they give you the piece about black women being doubly victimized, but they don't even complete the sentence next to it where she's saying, hey, black women are not intelligent compared to white women. Black women don't know anything but how to do laundry and chores, so we need to listen to the white woman. The white woman is the one who guides us into emancipation. And if we listen to the white woman, then we come full circle to the idea that black men are bad for us. Right? She acknowledges within the statement that she's getting this from white suffragettes, right? And that's why I really like Paula Giddings' quote, right? Because if I put that myself, nobody would believe it. Oh, this is misreading. But Paula Giddings says the same thing. She's like, look, Sojourner Truth bought into this racist logic offered to her by white suffragettes. And this really exposes something, because nobody cites that piece of Paula Giddings' work. Nobody cites the fact that Sojourner Truth, this statement that's been recycled year after year after year, is fundamentally based on a misinterpretation and a deliberately miscontextualization, because they're cutting the paragraph off of what she actually thinks about black men and where she's attributing that idea to. Right? It's known that she's got this from white suffragettes. It's known that she bought into this whole notion of inferiority. But for decades, people have been cutting that paragraph short so that we don't see the piece where it's mimicking the racism of white suffragists, but we appropriate this as a black feminist analysis. No, this is not a black feminist analysis. This is an analysis of white suffragettes using racist stereotypes and caricatures of black men to prevent them from getting the right to vote. And the real question is, how have we as academics not questioned why black feminists keep using this rhetorical trope as evidence of their double oppression, right? It's just not factually true, and we know that it has a seriously misguided source.
And just to be clear, I have nothing against Sojourner Truth. She's an ancestor, and she was confused, as I am too, to a certain degree, about how to solve this.
Yeah, we're all affected by oppression. It's not to single her out, right? It's not like, oh, she's uniquely bad in history, right? The issue is we have evidence that shows that the way that she came to this conclusion was not based on purely rational or empirical thought, right? That there's a certain ideological buy-in about the inferiority of her own people. And it's not just black men. Remember, she doesn't think black women are intelligent either, right? So we have to explain that. We have to deal with that. What we've been doing is we've been covering that up and pretending that it doesn't exist.
And just to kind of bolster Dr. Curry's quote here, it would be better for a black woman to be a slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant black one. So that's something that I do agree needs to be evaluated, for sure.
No, absolutely.
For sure. I want to talk here about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not, but in Central Park recently there's been an erection of statues for women in history, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and also Elizabeth Stanton. Are you aware of that?
I'm not. I heard something about it, about they were putting up monuments for them, but I didn't know it was in Central Park.
Yeah, it was celebrated by, former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton.
That's not surprising.
Yeah, yeah, and she, just to be clear, her words. Susan B. Anthony was a hero of hers. The same person who believed in eugenics, and what are the correlation between like the past feminists who believed in black men as beasts and people like Hillary Clinton who believe that black men are super predators? So what's the correlation between that?
Yeah, I mean, you could draw a direct line, right? I mean, I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version, but once you accept that, suffragettes in the 1860s up to the 1910s, 15s, right, were buying into ethnological science. So that basically ethnology said that black men were savages, they were brutes. They were writing letters, they were writing pamphlets, largely funded by racists like George Francis Train, who were trying to justify black people still staying enslaved. So part of that notion was like, listen, if you let these black men out, they're going to rape all the white women. And you have people like Rebecca Latimer Felter saying, like, look, your job as white men, as strong as the best men that are on the face of the earth, is to protect womanhood. So lynch 1,000 Negroes if you have to per week to make sure that white women are safe. Now, once you get past that period of time, then you're going into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s where you have white women making the exact same argument, but they're founding Klan organizations, they're segregationists, and they're saying, look, these black men are rapists. You have to keep them away from our race because they're gonna poison the blood stock of Anglo-Saxons in the South. Right? These are all very visible debates that people are having in support of segregation in the United States. Now, once you get past the 1940s and 50s and you get people pushing into the 1960s and 70s, you see this exact same language being picked up by feminists who are making arguments about the idea that rape is a mechanism of male domination and power. And this transition, right, from a feminism that is, or rather I should say, this transition from a rhetoric of feminism as being based in equality to the realization that feminism has always been a social movement based on reestablishing racial difference and racial segregation is something that a lot of scholars simply cannot get their mind around, right? So there's this view that's like, well, when we say feminists, we mean equality for women. Yeah, not really, because throughout history, you've had a racist view of black men where black men were savages and they're monsters that took away women. They took away women's rights because they're misogynistic, and they rape women because they're beasts. As you read with, William Lee Howard, right? The idea is that there's this genocidal and antecedent training that emerges when black men hit puberty. That was written in 1903, so even past, that's the early 20th century. I was born in 1979, so 76 years before I was born, you had these scientists still arguing that black men were rapists. By the time you get to 1975, which is 4 years before I was born, you have people like Susan Brown Miller, right, making the exact same argument, questioning whether or not black men rape in packs, using people like Amir Minicham's dissertation, right, talking about black men. The predominant number, the group that's most predisposed to rape are black men in Philadelphia, right? And he's of course bringing this stuff up because he's reading Wolfgang and Farrakut's subculture violence theories because this was his advisors. So even in the 1960s and 70s, white feminists are utilizing subculture violence theory, the idea that poor working class black men are drawn to violence as their fundamental value, and that this leads to a culture of rape. And Brown Miller appropriates that. She says that these poor black men use rape as a way to establish manhood. And you go to the 1980s, and guess who adopts that very same thesis? Bell Hooks. Right? The idea that black men are driven by patriarchal rage to rape and sexually prey on black women. Right? I mean, so this is all ideology. This is all ideology that you can literally draw a line from the 1860s all the way to the 1980s. And it's so problematic because all these black feminists that are creating intersectionality in 1989, who do you think they're reading? Right, like that's what I never understood about people. It's like this isn't some ideological trope. I'm saying let's just read people. Who is Jean Noble? Who is Bell Hooks? Right? Who are these people making these radical feminist claims? When I say radical feminism, I'm making that distinction between something like Marxist feminism or even the feminism that's talking more predominantly with social contract theory and paternalism like Carol Pateman, right? The radical feminists think that there's a fundamental antagonism between men and women, and that rape and sexual violence is the means by which that division and domination is enforced. So within this view of the radical feminists, who are these black women reading to come to the conclusion that black men, because they're patriarchal, use rape to dominate women? Either A, they're saying is just like, right, either A, they're reading white women, or B, they're reading the racist social science of Farrakouti, Wolfgang, and Menahem, right, to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, I find it interesting how you was able to draw that comparison, and I'm still able to see that now. It's just, man, it's something. It's really quite fascinating. So another topic here, buck studies. Are you familiar with sports, boxing, football, and basketball?
Yeah, of course.
I'm pretty sure you know about this already, but, with sports like football, there's the combine, and a lot of athletes are referred to as a beast, or they have that dog in them. And that's something in reference in terms of having a mental toughness or being able to overcome obstacles, but white athletes are referred to as being more cerebral or having intangibles. Can you talk about how that fits within this concept of buck studies?
Well, the very basic premise of buck studies is that we have a disposition towards evaluating black men as beasts, right? And I think that two things have happened. There's been an appropriation of this idea throughout history, where even our contemporary studies of masculinity, and I'm thinking of people here like Eichert, or people like Mark Anthony Neal. They look at the hypersexualization and the physicality of black men as the way to study and approach them. So the idea is that black men have somehow mistakenly or deliberately bought into the idea of their own sexual prowess. And I find that to be completely unreasonable, right? Because, like I said with the work of Amir Menahem, right? The idea is that black men are victimized by certain forms of violence, but instead of them being victims and forming some sort of intellectual resistance, they simply mimic it and adopt it. So think about that. So whereas black women are being raped throughout history, and the idea is, well, black women learn that to be the victim of rape means you have to fight against and struggle against rape and sexual violence, right? We find a history where black men have also been the victims of rape, but somehow we assert that they've just decided to become the rapist. So the same thing happens. This is what I mean in buck studies, right? This is why I call it the mimetic thesis, the mimetic problem. The idea in buck studies is that, well, black men suffer, but they just want to be the oppressors, right? So you have black men say, you're hyper-masculine, you're hyper-physical, you're superhuman. What do they say? You're absolutely right, master. You're absolutely right, white man. Let me go run this ball for you. Right? You see how that takes away any kind of reflection, right? Any kind of critical apparatus or consciousness that black men have. And then what ends up happening is you're like, oh, look at how violent these black men are in the NFL. And yeah, they bought into it because look, when you're in the NFL, look at all the cases of domestic abuse that black men are involved in. Or look at the brother Adrian Peterson, maybe who beat his son, who whipped his son. And we saw all kind of articles around that. Oh, football's a patriarchal culture, so they abuse women and they abuse children. And what does that sound like? Oh, Phoebe Cousins, 1800s, right? Oh, look at these black men who box. Look how violent they are. Look at Mike Tyson. He's a rapist. He's patriarchal. See? You can explain black men's violence because they buy into patriarchy and they rape women. See? Same thing, right? So buck studies is this idea, right, that you study black masculinity through the trope of imitation. That you're not and my argument against that is that you're not studying black men. You just start off with the premise that every form of black male violence in the world can be explained through their imitation of white male violence. And we have absolutely no proof for this, right? Because when we actually look at the data, we see that black women beat their kids actually more often than black men, because the rule of discipline actually is thought to belong with the black mother, right? And we see this across the board with working class mothers as well. But we see it particularly with black women in the black community. But nobody says that that's patriarchy, right? Nobody says that the black woman is beating the child to establish patriarchy. And the one person that does make that argument is Bell Hooks, and guess what? Nobody ever cites it. So there are no articles talking about black women beating children to establish patriarchal rule over them, even though that's a huge part of Bell Hooks' corpus. So then part of my argument is that black masculinity studies, because it's Buck studies, consistently overlooks other forms of violence perpetrated by demographics that it claims are innocent. So you look at same-sex couples, and you find that because of societal stigma and discrimination, poverty, right, and trauma, same-sex couples have higher rates of intimate partner violence than heterosexual couples in the United States. Not by much, slightly, equal to or slightly, right? Same rates of intimate partner violence, intimate terrorism. But you don't see literature saying same-sex couples, because they're homosexual, are trying to enforce patriarchy over each other. So what we end up doing is we highlight the trope of the buck, right? And we say that look at the black male, look at the black male run, look at the black male rape, look at the black male killed. And all that's explained because of white patriarchy. So what it means is that black men, just like Farrakouti and Wolfgang said, just like Menachem Amir is saying, do these types of things because it's within them. It's a culture that they've adopted to define themselves and their manhood. And what we've done in the academy is we said, hey, that's fine. We'll study black men as if they simply imitate all forms of social deviance from white men. And that's why we have now this issue. So now we see black men running, the 4-2, the 4-3, and we explain black men in that way because that's the only way that we've been given to talk about how black men actually perform or the motivations that black men have to get into sports. And what the man now says is like, well, look, let's stop looking at this as pathologies or worse yet ontologies, something that black men are just as defined as. Let's look at it sociologically. So if you have black women, black mothers in some cases, that don't emphasize academic achievement for black boys because they too believe that black boys are less intelligent than black girls, if you have a society that excludes black men and boys from certain institutions and certain jobs, even when they're blue collar, if black men are being pushed out of the economy where they're actually, engaging or having to compete with illegal immigrants for certain kinds of work, then why then do sports become glorified? Well, sociologically, sports is one of the only mechanisms that allows social mobility because everything else cuts them out of it. So is this an issue that they're drawn to boxing or football or basketball because of patriarchal manhood, or is it a really simple empirical question that can be answered by seeing which avenues allow them to mobilize outside of their circumstance? Right? That's what I'm doing differently. That's what I'm criticizing as Buck studies, and that's what I'm saying we're constantly getting wrong in our study of black masculinity.
Can we go for 30 more minutes here?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, perfect, because I have some more things I want to touch on. So before I get to the next question, I asked earlier about, transitioning to Scotland because I'm a big boxing fan, and there's a promoter in the UK. His name is Barry Hearn. He's the chairman of Matchroom Sports, which is a promotional company. And at a boxing conference, boxing weigh-in between Dillian White and Oscar Rivas, he made the comment about, bear in mind that Matchroom Sport has a fight-by-fight arrangement with Dillian. Mm-hmm. Dillian White, that is. He's not tied up in a slave contract of yesteryear. When I was running boxing, it was much easier. We were slave traders. These guys were working for us, and we were the boss. The pendulum has now swung. Now I have to say, Mr. Dillian White, I have to be respectful, and it's a really nice position because now we could be honest with each other. Does that sound like privilege to you, Dr. Curry?
No, that sounds like commodification of slavery.
Exactly. Another concept that that I hear about that I've always had questions about was black male involvement in the lives of their children and the lives of their family. Can you talk about black male involvement in the family and how black males are statistically more involved in their children's lives than others?
Absolutely. Again, for me, this is largely a question that we settle like empirically. You know what I mean? Like, if you read Bell Hooks' Read Real Cool in 2004, she has this whole several pages where she goes through and she says, look, black men were never taught to be fathers. Black men are not good fathers. Black men have only been taught to value sex, right? This is what she's articulating as theory. And what ends up happening is, and I want to be very clear here, like, this is what happens in the academy. Like, that's not true. All the data we have for the last 20 or 30 years, I mean, Robert Staples was writing about this back in the 80s, shows that black men are really good social fathers, that black men are really involved in their communities, and that there's an extended family network where black men take up, the slack and pick up relationships where other men are missing. But somehow none of that ever makes it into the notions of the work of bell hooks. So you have to fight this uphill battle to introduce empirical evidence, studies, and facts that show that black men are, in fact, great fathers, right? But the problem is in the academy, when you criticize bell hooks, people will reject your article on face for that reason by itself. So the idea becomes, well, yeah, she says things that are false, but you can't attack her for it. So what ends up happening is that you have this censoring dynamic where you have all this empirical evidence, right? It feels like sociology, social work, CDC studies that are saying, look at how great black men actually are, right? There are even some black feminists, right? Ellen Simeon. There's white feminists like Catherine Hornoy, people like Kathleen Bleed, right, who've all done empirical work showing, look how progressive black men are, right? Michael Dawson's Black Vision. Look at how progressive black men are. And none of that seems to matter. None of that seems to generate any kind of conversation because people censor it within the academy, right? But the more important thing then is, well, then why is it that empirical fields, right? Because what I'm talking about are the theoretical fields, philosophy, women and gender studies, etc. But then how is it that these empirical fields keep finding this stuff? How is it that Robert Staples found it? How is it that people like, Dr. Wisdom Powell, who's at UConn now, finds it? How is it that all these people keep finding how wonderful black men are when you go and study black men, but within gender theory, you can't seem to find it, right? So I think that what ends up happening is like, look, black men are extremely good fathers. There's research that shows that, even when black men are in jail and get out of jail, they're more involved than other fathers in their lives. One of the only things that can take black fathers away from their children is whether or not they can find work, right? You see black men spending more hours with their children, doing more household chores with their wives. They have more progressive values. They support their wives' education. They support their wives working. They're more sensitive to issues of sexual harassment than other groups of men. I could go on and on and on, right? Black men as a group are the most progressive groups of men on gender and sexual violence that the world has ever seen. That's what the data says. But the theory insists that you view them as monsters. Feminist theories have consistently tried to tell you that even though you have all this evidence of what black men are, you should rather center the minority of them who are abusers, deviants, and rapists as the basis of how you interpret them. And people may disagree with that statement, but I would challenge anyone who disagrees with that statement to tell me the sustained discourse. What is the other logic? What is the other field that's telling you that black men are fundamentally violent, fundamentally driven to hurt and dominate people, are fundamentally driven towards rape and sexual abuse or physical abuse simply because they're men and patriarchal? There's only one discourse that does that. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we get the life of black men, the social realities of black men and boys, their kindness, their creativity, their innovation, to become the basis of how we interpret them throughout the world, right? And that's what Black Male Studies does, right? It's trying to get us to see, follow the empiricism, follow the actual observations of black men in the world, in their homes, in their communities, in their schools, and look at the brilliance and the humanity that's being shown there, rather than trying to confine them as an object to these decadent feminist tropes, right? These decadent subculture of violence theories, these decadent notions of intersectionality and masculinity that sees no diversity in manhood at all, right? We can't keep showing that black men consistently vote more progressively than most of the women in the United States, even black women sometimes. You can't keep showing that black men love their children, that black men fight for their children, that black men spend more time with their children, that black men care about their families. That, you have all these different forms of evidence. Even when you look at black men's definitions of masculinity, they define it not as individualistic or, capitalistic. They define it as communal and racially responsible. Like, you can't keep doing data and studies on black men that show you who they are and then dismiss it because it doesn't fit the tropes of intersectionality and feminism that you've committed yourself to be advocates for, right? And I think that's the thing, right? We have tremendous amounts of evidence showing what black men are about. And I think when people think about their own black fathers, the black men in their communities, that you'll see that dynamic existing quite readily. We have to fight against the theoretical apparatus that tells us to not look at the empirical evidence and only look at the caricatures that have been built in by theorists.
I think maybe just black men need to continue to invest in an investment fund and, keep continuing to pay off these researchers and the National Health Statistics, CDC. We need to just continue to keep paying these people to, advocate for us, because it's obvious that's what we're doing. Is that correct, Dr. Curry?
Well, I think I think that the CDC study came about just because it was an interesting finding, right? They found it in a data set, right, and they published it. But I think that black men, and again, this is why I created Black Male Studies. I think black men have to be invested in being their own researchers, right? They have to be fundamentally invested in telling their own stories, despite how unpopular it is. So I'm constantly attacked, right? People are like, you hate black women because you study black men. God, what else is it? Your book's illogical, even though it won an American Book Award. That nobody's reading it, even though it was recommended by the Brookings Institute. There's all kind of stuff, right, that people say because they don't want to deal with their deep-seated hatred, or what I call anti-black or racist misandry towards black men and boys. And that's fine, because that's just how history goes. Somebody has a new idea, a bunch of people get pissed off about it, and then history's going to decide whether or not I'm right or wrong, right? But the issue is black men have to become invested in understanding themselves. And I don't mean by that we're invested in just defending ourselves from everything. We have to be invested in studying ourselves, understanding why there are some forms of deviance, right, in our communities. But always remembering that the kinds of deviance that we're talking about in our communities are the minor portions of it. We're talking about demographics that are less than 0.5%, right? There are almost 13 million adult black men over the age of 18 in the United States. When you're talking about people who are convicted of rape, you're talking about 5,000. When you're talking about people who kill intimate partners for domestic abuse or intimate partner homicide, you're talking about 200 to 300, right? At best, the highest numbers in several decades. So you have to ask yourself, why then is 200 or 300 individuals in random places throughout the United States, right, certain kind of neighborhoods, certain kind of, they have the same kind of, disposition, poor, uneducated, unemployed usually, right, forms of trauma, some kind of, substance or alcohol abuse, etc. Why are these people being used as a standard by which to interpret black men, right? That's the question. Because you're not going down and looking at the homeless white man or the serial killer interpret white men and women. You're not looking at the white mother who's raping students or the white mother who just killed 6 or 7 of her children to interpret white women. You're not even looking at the black mother who statistically has higher rates of spousal abuse against her husbands or child abuse with her children than white women do, or the black woman who usually is associated with some form of sexual debut for younger black boys. That's not the standard. When you think black woman, you don't center deviance first. But with black men, you do. And that's what I'm pointing out. Black men are the only group in the academy, in U.S. institutions, that are theorized through their deviance first, despite the overwhelming evidence that they're more progressive than all the white people in the country and most of the women in the country. So the question becomes, how then do we sustain that argument, right? How then do we sustain that? And that's not through more feminist tropes, right? Now, black feminism has its place in studying black women. Nobody's making an argument against that. The question is the limitation. What is the limitation of black feminist thought? The limitation of black feminist thought is that it can't see beyond its own objectification of the male. It needs black men to be boogeymen so they can sustain its analysis of patriarchy. So then black men don't need to have a conversation about that. If that's what their theory wants to do, let them have their theory. The question is, how does empiricism fundamentally refute the a priori assumptions that black feminism and intersectionality make about systems of relationships between racism, gender, and poverty? Right? Capitalist violence and exploitation, sexual violence and assault, right? And racism in terms of racist death and the homicidal drive and social inequality. How are those things empirically verified, and how can they be predicted or made to cohere given what we're theorizing in black male studies? Right? And that's the investment they should have. We need our own researchers. We need our own pots of money. We need our own chairs in this. People are fundamentally committed to working out the empiricism, the history, and then creating theories that make that coherent and can accurately predict the situation of black men and boys for decades to come.
For sure. Can you talk about a few ways that black males suppress their masculinity to not appear as threats?
Oh wow, yeah. There's lots of literature on that. Robert Livingston's work is one. There's constant fear, just accounts of black men who don't want to appear as sexual threats, so they kind of make themselves into eunuchs and asexual around women, especially white women. It's just a coping mechanism, man. It's like, Hendon said, or no, I'm sorry, Calvin Hurden, made the argument that his grandmother told him that to survive in the South, that he had to basically become a eunuch, that he could not seem flirtatious or present himself as a virile young man around white women because they were going to make him into a rapist, right? They were going to say that he was a rapist by doing that. So I think that that's a fear that many black men walk around with today, especially in the age of Me Too and some of the Title IX jurisprudence that's going on in American universities. We know disproportionately that these things are affecting black men. We're talking about ridiculous rates, like something like, black men are 5% of a population and 60-70% of people convicted are charged with Title IX violations. So, in order to be safe, black men have very much had to interact and engage the world as if it was still Jim Crow. In terms of how they approach women, how they, even when they have proof that sex was consensual, it's still viewed as rape. These are very, very much the same kind of Jim Crow tropes and characteristics that black men have endured throughout history. And I think that without making it very, very clear that these kinds of logics, this is why I always study segregational logics, right? Because I'm interested in how the need for racial proxemics are for the spaces that races need to have separate from each other, how these types of things constantly reinvent themselves. So if you want to keep black men separate or black people separate from white people, how does the trope of the hypersexual black male or the black male rapist operate to justify those kinds of things? You don't want black men in college. How does Title IX jurisprudence get manipulated or used to suggest that many black men or black male athletes are in fact rapists, sexual abusers, etc. Right? So I think black men have adopted a certain kind of eunuch persona in many cases to remain safe, so that they don't become spotlight, attacked, or condemned for being rapists.
And this concept of being a eunuch can be seen in the labor field as well, because you wrote about this on page 108. You said, overwhelmingly black men as a group are blue-collar workers. However, for the few who occupy the skilled labor sectors of America, assumptions of male privilege and power have followed. Historically, black men often fare worse than black women in professional and skilled employment settings because of different stereotypes applied to black males and the level of education between the groups. Can you talk about the importance of documenting and researching these issues and how they affect unemployment rates and overall financial instability of these people's families?
No, absolutely. If I remember correctly, that's the Robert Livingston study and the Tilly and Moss work. So Livingston had a really good piece, that had a lot of ties to social dominance theory, where he showed that even educated black men, if they appeared to be too knowledgeable about a subject, were thought to be aggressive, right? So one of the ways that people code black men is that if you know too much, or if you're more intelligent than your counterpart, the people that you're competing against, you're going to read that as aggression first and foremost, right? The second issue is that in environments of managerial positions or CEOs, that threat construction often has to be mediated through what he says as a disarming mechanism. So that's smiling a lot, having a baby face, telling jokes, making people think that you're funny. All these things are important because any black man who's thought to be too intelligent or too smart pays a severe penalty, usually not getting the job or being harshly discriminated against while on the job, right? Black men cannot be better than white people in environments where, those very same populations are more willing to accept more intelligent black women. The Moss and Tilly finding is really interesting because what it says is that when employers are trying to hire black people, they make very, very gendered perceptions. So on the one hand, there's a view that, black women are loud, arrogant, ignorant, all these things. And, of course, black men are stupid, lazy, etc. But those are racist stereotypes. When those stereotypes come in contact with each other, then what ends up happening is they switch each other on and off. So if a black man's competing with a white woman, right, then of course the racial stereotype takes over. He's lazy, let's hire the white woman. But if a black man is competing with a black woman, then the racist stereotypes of her being independent, arrogant, strong-willed becomes explained away and becomes positive because she has to be independent. She has to be strong because she's dealing with a lazy, non-intelligent, unemployed black man. So what their studies found was that there's an engagement and interaction between certain kinds of stereotypes, where negative racial stereotypes can become positive gender stereotypes given the right kind of interaction for employers. And as often is the case, black men, because they're perceived to be dangerous and less intelligent, have less soft skills. They don't connect well with, they're not thought to connect well with clients. They're thought to be scary, so they're not going to be a good front face for the businesses. So they usually end up on the bottom or getting the short end of the stick in terms of these employment decisions. Right? So they don't get hired very often over other groups, including black women. And I think that once you put all this stuff together, then it becomes pretty easy to see that you're not going to get to that line of analysis under our present rubrics, right? The way that we think about black men, masculinity, and everything now does not bring you to these kinds of conclusions if you do not have a very strict knowledge of how racialized masculinity, specifically black masculinity, operates when it actually engages or touches on issues with other groups of people.
So in a nutshell, a black man with no facial hair and a black man who does a 5-minute stand-up set every time he sees a white person at work, that kind of explains why they do that, because they want to be able to suppress their masculinity.
Yeah, and I mean, Livingston is looking at, if I remember, CEOs are really high-paid, like high-powered positions, right, manager positions. But yeah, he says that you have to do that even there. So I mean, it would hold true even in the managerial literature, because even when you're looking at just workplace managers, black men are perceived as being more threatening and out of place than their female counterparts and white people generally. So I think that's a safe hypothesis.
Are you familiar with McKinsey and Company released a paper, I believe in October, about the widening racial gap and how that's going to affect African American workers due to automation? Are you familiar with that?
I did. I read an editorial about it. I didn't read the actual study though.
Yeah, what you're saying here kind of relates. What you're saying now at this point kind of relates to this article, because it says that by 2030, the unemployment outlook for African Americans, particularly men, younger workers between the ages of 18 and 35 without a college degree, may worsen drastically. And it's saying that the possible displacement rate is 24.8%, which is significantly well, not that much significantly, but it's significantly higher than African American women, which is 21.6%, which I found interesting. They're saying that the displacement rate for African American women is lower than any other racial or gender group in our society, which I don't know how that's the case, but that was very interesting.
I mean, I'd have to see what they actually measured, but I mean, it could possibly be because if there could be a selection bias if they were only measuring full-time employees, because a lot of black women work, they're underemployed, so they work multiple part-time jobs. It could be just the sample they're looking at. Most black women do work in some kind of white-collar work. Black men usually work in blue-collar work, so they could, so black men would be overrepresented in that sample if that's what they're measuring. There's just lots of things. I actually have to read the study, but I think that what's really important, though, is that given that black men usually work blue-collar jobs and they work tremendous amounts of overtime compared to their female counterpart, then there is a very big risk that automation would knock them out first and most severely, and there would not be jobs to replace them, right? So it's not like if I got fired for construction or McDonald's or something else, I'm not going to be able to readily find a job that replaces that because I'm already competing at the very bottom of the blue-collar, barrel, so to speak.
Oh, so if you're underemployed, then you probably won't see as much displacement as opposed to someone that's doing a job that's more blue-collar.
Yeah, so underemployment, so like let's say I'm a blue-collar worker working, 40 hours a week at McDonald's, right? And so I'm full employed there, right? An underemployment situation would be, let's say I had somebody working, say, 22 hours at McDonald's a week and 30 hours at Burger King, right? So those are both two part-time jobs because neither one of them are full-time, 40-plus hours a week. So that person's working more, but they don't get health insurance. They don't get any of those benefits. So it could be the case that when automation kicks in, maybe there's still work for people to do on a part-time basis, right? Versus the automation just kicked out all your full-time employees. So you could see something like that happening.
Understood. So in the face of racism and just anti-black male biases, what do you suggest going forward that, I would say, let me just say black men and women, what do you suggest that we do to try to counter some of these issues that come up with automation and just dealing with racism in general to be prepared for this new economy?
Well, I mean, that's tough, man. I think Derek Hamilton or Sandy Darity would probably be better at answering that question. In terms of what we can do to better deal with racism, I think one of the things is we have to stop perpetuating the class divisions and the deficit models amongst ourselves. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the different rates of social mobility and assimilation within America has made it very difficult to have a notion of black solidarity. I think that's probably a doomed project at this point. So the best that black people can do is in those communities that are brought together and cohere because of their economic circumstance. There has to be a new theory of economic and political organization, right? Black Lives Matter wasn't it. It got bought out by white liberals in a heartbeat. It was covered by white media, and it didn't help any of the people that it said it was going to help. So much of the issue surrounding this, I think, has to be at a grassroots level, how working-class black people understand, relate, and organize themselves given the impositions of white power in the United States. The second thing is we need black scholars to better articulate the effects that police killings, incarceration, and poverty are having on birth weight, demographic growth, and the kinds of resources that our people are going to need for the next century. We don't have any kind of programs in place where black scholars are actually lending themselves to understand the structural material needs of black people in this kind of country in the coming decades. We constantly talk about what we don't have, why we're not getting jobs, why we experience discrimination, but what would it take for a race to be vibrant? I think Sandy Darity's done great work in talking about having to build up wealth and how that only comes from reparations, but there are other things as well. I mean, we need our psychologists, our social workers all on call here to understand what we need for the community to actually thrive. And lastly, I think in terms of theorists, there has to be a fight in the academy. Because black people have been bought off to such a great extent that we're writing the pathological tropes for white people. We're doing it ourselves, right? So given that system, we have to do something that's much, much different in order for us not only to have a way to interpret ourselves positively, but also have some kind of image of humanity to present to the world that actually positively influences opinion makers and policy makers to the small extent that we actually can.
Yeah, I appreciate you breaking down that advice by tiers because, my whole thing is entrepreneurship, and my suggestion would be to think about problems that exist in your life, your own community, and think about ways to solve it. That's how I started my business. I thought about ways that to solve some problems that was in my local community, and it allowed me to think about ways to research and find people who were doing that successfully, get up under them, get some information, research, and take it from there. But do you have any more research that you want to talk about that's upcoming now?
Much of our research now is looking at the sexual vulnerability of black males. So we're doing, small focus groups and surveys on black male victims of rape, and just a better idea of how we could actually treat them and help them heal, right? Like how do we connect them to clinicians and services and things of that sort. The next big project I'm working on is going to be understanding why black males, and other racialized men too, but specifically black men, are constantly recreated throughout the centuries as a trope of savagery, right? That they're always outside the society. So I think that those are the next two major research projects that I'm engaging on.
Are there any resources that you would suggest that men try to get in contact with, or boys who may have been assaulted or?
Man, it's hard. I mean, Rain has some resources, but even when we were doing our first study, there wasn't there wasn't a hotline that specifically focused on the rape and abuse of black males, right? So, I think that's part of the issue. I think part of this is trying to build up resources for black men so that they can actually, have institutions, have clinicians, have safe spaces where they could talk about this. So, yeah, unfortunately, that's still a work in progress.
Man, any social media that you want to promote before we leave?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Dr. TJC. And of course, if people just Google me, they'll be able to find out my email and contact information. So I'm always welcome or happy to talk to people. I definitely got to recommend The Man Not. I think the book, I'm the author, so of course I'm a little biased, but I think the book really does offer different kinds of resources and theories that just aren't available right now. And while the book may be controversial to some people, it's the only book of its kind right now. So I think there's something to be said about not only that trajectory, right, trying to do something new, but just the effect that it's had. I get emails from people all the time talking about how the book has saved their lives, how the book is allowing people to go, get help, seek, stop some brothers from feeling like they had to kill themselves. So it's had a real material effect on how black men see themselves and see the world. So I think that, my hope is that the black community, rather than me and my peers in the academy, really see what I was doing and really can appreciate the kind of humbleness that I come to the project with, that I'm trying to build something that allows black men and boys to reclaim a small part of their humanity, but also for the black community as a whole to understand what black men and boys go through and why it's important for us to actually know that and try to solve that as black people together. I don't pick a group, I don't, and I think people see this when you read the book, but, I don't pick a group to say that group is perfect, nor has to be defended in all cases, because that's not scholarship, that's ideology. What I'm trying to do is understand how a subpopulation, how black men and boys live in a world that's fundamentally hostile to them, and what it means for us to actually view their humanity as something that we should all be invested in and something that we should all try to cultivate. And I think that if we do that, then some of these tropes that we have of black men as rapists, deviants, criminals, and threats would automatically disappear because they'll be exposed for the kind of racist tropes that they actually are.
For sure. I'll be sure to put that link to the Amazon link in the description, because I believe it was a great book, and
thank you.
A lot of the stereotypes, black people being black men being homophobic, black men being rapists, and all of these different tropes, they were definitely examples of that's not the case, and some people actually struggle with a lot of different things that people are accusing black people of being. So it definitely, like I said, it definitely was a tough read for sure. I gotta admit that, but
hey, I appreciate you struggling through, bro.
Definitely has a lot of information, and I just want to thank you for getting on a call here all the way from Scotland, and
we'll
be in touch. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.